Welcome to Somewhere Along the Way. I'm Dennis, and I'm glad you found your way here. Every story you'll hear on this channel is written and narrated by me. Some drawn from memory, others inspired by the people, places, and moments that have stayed with me over the years. This channel, it's simply a place to slow down for a little while, to remember, to reflect, and to enjoy a good story. So, wherever you're listening from, please know, I'm really glad that you're here. Let's jump right in to today's story. The last bump in Gerald's driveway was always the worst. And the funny thing is, we knew it was there and hit it every time. My partner eased the rescue toward the road as slowly as he could, but there was no way around it. The rear tires dropped into the shallow rut, the suspension shifted beneath us, and everything in the back of the ambulance seemed to move at once. Cabinet doors rattled. Equipment pulled against its straps. The gurney rocked beneath my hand. Even the smallest bump can feel enormous in the back of an ambulance. Then the tires climbed onto the asphalt. The rattling stopped. The ride became smooth, and Gerald opened his eyes. He drew in a long, deep breath, almost as if he just resurfaced from somewhere far away. For a moment, he stared toward the ceiling. Then his head turned slightly on the pillow and his eyes found mine. "Hello, Gerald." I smiled. "It's nice to see you again." Strange words, perhaps, considering where we were. But Gerald and I had done this before. Over the previous 18 months, I had transported him to the hospital at least 6 times. I'd been inside his home often enough to know the gravel driveway, the narrow path through the living room, and the exact angle required to maneuver a gurney through the front door. I knew his wife. I knew his adult children. I'd even met some of his grandchildren. And even though he couldn't say my name, Gerald knew who I was. Cancer had taken his voice long before he and I had met. But still, there was recognition in his eyes. During our time together, Gerald and I had developed a language of our own. A raised hand, a slight nod, a movement of his fingers, the way his eyes shifted towards something he needed. His signs, they were crude and sometimes difficult to follow. But after enough visits, I usually figured it out. At least, I thought I did. That morning, though, he didn't move his hands. He just simply looked at me. You know, there are ways that people look at you when they're frightened, ways they look at you when they're in pain, ways they look at you when they need reassurance but don't know how to ask for it. I had seen all those expressions during my years on the rescue. This was different. Gerald's face, it held something quieter that day. Something that had been waiting for me to notice. A tear gathered in the corner of his right eye. It stayed there for just a moment, catching the dim light inside of the ambulance. Then it slipped free and traveled along the side of his face, disappearing into the thin hair above his ear. Another followed. I reached for a piece of gauze and gently wiped his cheek. Gerald continued looking at me. He had spent so much of his previous 18 months living in silence, sitting, watching, listening, waiting for someone to understand what he could no longer put into words. I often wondered what filled those quiet hours. Did he listen to his family while they talked around him? Did he even remember the sound of his own voice? Did he think about the life that he had lived before cancer reduced his world to a few rooms, a recliner, and the people who came and went through the front door? Perhaps he watched his wife moving around the house and remembered when they had been younger. Perhaps he had thought about his children when they were small. Or perhaps he had rehearsed conversations he would never be able to have. Or maybe pain had consumed so much of his attention that there was little left room for anything else. I never asked, though. I'm not sure Gerald could have answered. By then, his body had taken away almost every ordinary way a person makes himself known. His voice, it was gone. His strength, it was fading. Even lifting one hand required more effort than it felt possible. So Gerald had learned to speak with whatever remained. That morning, he spoke with his eyes. Lying there beneath the ambulance lights, tears moving silently across his face, Gerald looked exhausted. There was no panic in him, no confusion. He knew where he was. He knew who I was. And I had the unmistakable sense that he had been waiting for this conversation much longer than I had realized. The monitor continued tracing his heartbeat beside us, the tires humming against the road. My partner, he drove towards the hospital while the October morning slowly brightened beyond the windows. Inside the rescue, Gerald and I watched one another. Before I could understand what he wanted from me that morning, I had to remember everything he had already tried to say. And most of what I knew about Gerald, I had learned while he sat quietly in that old recliner. The recliner sat near the center of Gerald's living room. I don't remember its color anymore. My memory held on to Gerald, but it let the chair fade into the background. What I remember is the shape of him sitting there. His body settled deep into the cushions, one arm resting near his side. His head angled slightly forward or leaning against the back, depending on how much strength he had for that day. A blanket sometimes covered his legs. The recliner, it had become more than a place to sit. It's where Gerald slept. It's where he watched television. It's where his wife cared for him. It's where his grandchildren gathered when they came to visit. It was there when he struggled through difficult breaths and received the people who arrived carrying medications, equipment, and worried expressions. But by the time I entered his life, that chair, it had just become a small piece of ground Gerald occupied while the rest of the world continued moving around him. Honestly, I had lifted him out of that chair more times than I could remember. I knew where to place my hands. I knew how far the footrest extended into the room. I knew which piece of furniture had to be moved before we could bring the gurney closer. Those details become automatic after enough visits. But there was always something strangely intimate about lifting Gerald from that chair. For a few moments, he had to surrender the full weight of his body to us. His arms, they'd settle around our shoulders. Our faces would pass close by to his. He trusted us to hold him upright when his own legs could no longer do so. Then we would lower him onto the gurney, secure the straps, and begin another trip through the front door. Cancer had been taking Gerald apart slowly, organ by organ, piece by piece. It had already taken his voice, then his mobility, then the simple privacy of moving through his own home without someone's help. The man his family remembered was still sitting somewhere inside of him. We could see traces of that man in his eyes. The rest had become increasingly difficult to reach, though. I thought about that often. What happens to a person when the body becomes the smallest part of his life and yet the largest part of every day? How did Gerald experience all those hours in that recliner? From where he sat, he could watch his wife move through the room. He could hear the telephone ring, the television playing, and the conversations drifting in from other parts of the house. His children came through the door carrying news from lives that continued beyond those walls. Sometimes, his grandchildren appeared with the restless energy children bring into a quiet room. Everyone arrived from somewhere. But after everyone had left, Gerald, he remained in the chair. He must have heard people speaking about him as though he were both present and yet somewhere else. Hospice workers discussed his comfort. Family members talked about medications, appointments, and whether his breathing seemed worse than it had the day before. We arrived with questions that required answers he could no longer give easily. Gerald listened while other people translated his life into decisions. I wondered how often they got it right. I mean, there must have been things he wanted to say. Ordinary things, like turn down the television or move the blanket, open the window, or stay a little longer. And there were probably larger things too. Things a man says to his wife after sharing a lifetime with her. Things a father wants his children to remember. Things that become more urgent when time grows short and more difficult when the words are gone. Maybe Gerald had already said everything that mattered, though. Perhaps he was still composing entire conversations in his own head. I never knew. His silence left room for everyone around him to imagine what he wanted. His family imagined one thing. I began to suspect another. During our visits, I learned to watch him closely. A tightening near his eyes told me when movement hurt. A slight turn of his head could answer a question. If he wanted something, his hand would lift slowly from the arm of the recliner and form a gesture that made sense only after you had spent a little bit of time with him. Sometimes, I understood immediately. But a lot of the times, he had to try again. Fortunately, Gerald was patient with me. Most of the time, anyway. But every now and again, frustration appeared across his face when I failed to understand something he believed he had made perfectly clear. But I couldn't blame him, though. Losing your voice must be difficult enough. Having to train everyone around you to listen with their eyes seemed especially cruel. Over time, though, our conversations required a lot less effort. He would make a small motion. I would ask a question. He would nod or shake his head. Little by little, over time, we learned each other. I never knew Gerald before he became ill. I never knew what kind of work he had done, what made him laugh, or whether he had once been the loudest person in the room. Perhaps he had been quiet his entire life, or maybe he was the kind of guy that silence always suited him. In the end, though, cancer made that decision for him. You know, it's funny because whenever I think about Gerald now, I still see him in that recliner. But I no longer see only a dying man waiting for the next ambulance. I see someone living an entire private life behind a face that could reveal only part of it. Watching his family. Watching strangers come in and out of his home. Watching his body surrender one small freedom after another. And somewhere inside all that silence, Gerald had reached a decision. While the people who loved him most were still trying to reach theirs. Gerald's wife always met us at the door. Sometimes she was composed, sometimes frightened. Other times, she had the exhausted look of someone who had been listening to another person breathe all night. Caring for someone who is dying changes the way you hear a room. A pause becomes suspicious. A shallow breath draws your attention from across the house. Silence wakes you faster than the noise. By the time we had arrived, she had usually been watching Gerald for hours, waiting for the next change, wondering whether this was the moment everyone had warned her about. Gerald was in hospice care. The paperwork was there. So was the do not resuscitate order. His wishes had been discussed, documented, and placed somewhere the family could reach when the time came. But the time written about on a piece of paper is very different from the time that arrives in your living room. When Gerald stopped breathing, his wife would look at the man in the recliner and ask us to bring him back. So we did. 3 different times. 3 times I helped resuscitate him. At least 6 times I had transported him to the hospital. Each call began in nearly the same place. The open front door. The worried faces. Gerald lying back in the recliner while his family gathered around him. Then came the equipment, the gurney, and the carefully coordinated movement through the house. Hours, perhaps days later, Gerald would usually return. Back through the same doorway. Back into the same living room. Back to the chair waiting for him. For many years, I thought of those calls the way firefighters often think about familiar addresses. For us, Gerald was a frequent flyer. The phrase made the repetition just a little easier to manage. It placed the call into a category we understood. People with chronic illnesses, they called often. And some addresses became so familiar that hearing the street name was enough to picture the room waiting at the other end. But after enough visits, Gerald's home no longer felt like a location on a dispatch screen. It was the place where his wife was losing him. Honestly, though, she had been losing him for a long time. But cancer rarely takes everything in a single moment. It removed Gerald from her life gradually, while leaving him seated just a few feet away. She had watched his strength disappear. She had learned to care for the opening in his neck. She had learned the schedules, medications, and small rituals that shaped their days. She had learned how to understand the man she loved after his voice had left him. It seemed that every new loss required her to meet a slightly different version of their life together. Then his breathing would stop, and she was expected to decide whether this loss would be the final one. I don't know whether anyone can prepare for that. She understood what the DNR meant. She and Gerald had chosen it together. But this understanding, it did very little when she stood beside his chair and watched his chest remain still. In that moment, the document asked her to accept that every ordinary thing they had done together was simply over. No more mornings in the same house. No more reaching for him during the night. No more hearing someone moving in the next room and knowing you were not alone. Even grief had not fully begun because Gerald was still there in front of her. She would look at us and ask for more time. Just a few more days, another week, maybe one more opportunity to actually become ready. I never judged her for asking. I also began to wonder what each return cost Gerald. When he opened his eyes in the hospital, did he feel relieved? Was he disappointed? Was he angry? Did he understand that his wife had asked us to intervene again? Did part of him forgive her before the question ever formed? Perhaps he understood that her request came from the same love that had kept her beside his chair through every stage of his illness. Perhaps that made it easier. It could have made everything harder, though, too. His adult children carried their own versions of the same conflict. They stood near the walls or moved furniture out of the way. They answered questions, gathered medications, and watched us work on their dad. Sometimes, Gerald's grandkids were there, too. I look back, though, and wonder what they actually remembered. The recliner, the ambulance lights against the house, the adults speaking in careful voices, their grandfather disappearing through the front door on another gurney. Families, they begin grieving long before someone dies. They grieve each change, the ability that doesn't return, every conversation that will never happen in quite the same way again. And still, they make breakfast, they answer the telephone, they take out the trash, and they sit beside the recliner and watch television. Life continues performing its ordinary routines while everyone waits for something unbearable. Somewhere during those 18 months, I began to see the distance growing between Gerald and the people who loved him. His family kept reaching toward him, but Gerald seemed to be turning quietly towards something else. He had reached the point where rest meant more than another return home. His wife had reached no such place, though. I stood between them more than once with my medical bag at my feet and the ability to interrupt what Gerald's body had already begun. Each time, his wife asked. Each time, my training supplied the next step. And each time Gerald came back, I wondered whether we had returned him to his family, or had we taken him away from the peace he had already found. The first time Gerald told me he was ready to die, he never used a word. We were traveling to the hospital on another one of those familiar trips. The rescue, it moved along the same road. Gerald, he laid upon the same gurney. I sat on the bench beside him, watching the effort behind every breath. Pain had tightened his face. His shoulders lifted slightly each time he inhaled, as though his body had forgotten how to breathe without involving every muscle it could find. I gave him morphine. The medication was intended to soften the pain and ease some of the distress that came with trying to pull air through a body already working way too hard. I watched him closely as it entered his system. And after just a few short moments, some of the tension around his eyes began to loosen. His breathing became a little less desperate, but the pain was still there. Gerald lifted one hand from the gurney. The movement was slow. It was deliberate. He gestured toward the medication, then toward himself. More. I understood. I gave him another dose within the amount I was allowed to give, and then I waited. The rescue continued toward the hospital. The monitor traced his heartbeat. I watched his breathing and gave the medication time to work. Gerald watched me. After a while, though, his hand, it rose again. The same gesture. More. I explained that I'd already given him what I could. But his eyes, they remained locked with mine. He repeated the motion. This time, there was no mistaking what he meant. Gerald was not asking for another small measure of relief. He wanted enough morphine to end the pain completely. Enough to quiet his breathing. Enough to make this his final trip. Gerald understood what he was asking me to do. And for a moment, neither of us looked away. There are limits in medicine that can be explained through protocols, dosages, and laws. Those limits are clear when discussed in a classroom. But they become much harder to hold while sitting beside a suffering man who is asking you, as plainly as he can, to help him leave. I had spent years learning how to relieve pain. But in that moment, Gerald showed me pain that I could only reach part way. The rest belonged to something larger than medication. It lived in the months he had spent inside that recliner, in every breath that required effort, in the voice that he had lost, in the family he loved and the body that would no longer release him without bringing him to the edge of a decision they could not make. I told him I couldn't give him any more. The answer sounded thin inside that ambulance. He continued to stare at me. I expected anger, but instead, his face settled into an expression of disappointment, and I understood. It may have been resignation. It may have been the quiet recognition that I understood him, even though I couldn't give him what he wanted. He lowered his hand. The conversation was over. The monitor continued its steady rhythm. The rescue kept moving. And I returned to the things I knew how to do. I checked his breathing. I watched his blood pressure. And I made sure he remained as comfortable as I could keep him until we reached the hospital. But something between us had changed. Before that ride, I understood that Gerald was sick. I knew that he was dying. I knew his body had become a painful place to live. After that ride, I understood that Gerald was finished. He had trusted me with something his family may not have been ready to hear. He wanted the treatments to stop. He wanted the repeated returns to stop as well. He wanted someone to understand that continuing to live and continuing to be brought back were no longer the same thing. I carried that knowledge into every visit that followed. Each time the address came across the radio, I wondered whether Gerald would still be there when we arrived. Each time I saw him in the recliner, I remembered his hand lifting from the gurney. Each time his wife asked us to help him, I remembered what he had asked of me. I never mentioned the morphine request to Gerald again. He never repeated it, but he didn't have to. Some conversations, they remain unfinished because the people involved already understand the ending. Weeks later, when Gerald opened his eyes on that final October morning and looked at me with tears moving silently across his face, I recognized the question. This time, he wasn't asking me to give him something. He was asking me to stop. That final trip had begun less than an hour earlier while I was packing to go home. It was October. I don't remember the year. The year has long since disappeared with hundreds of other dates from my career. What's remained, though, was the morning itself. The sun was taking longer to rise. The station lights reflected against the dark windows, and the apparatus bay still carried the coolness of the night. Somewhere in the kitchen, coffee was brewing. Cabinet opened and closed down the hall. The oncoming crew would begin arriving soon. I had stripped the sheets from my bed and gathered the things that had wandered out of my locker during the shift. A change of clothes. There was a book I hadn't even opened. And whatever had collected in my pockets over the previous 24 hours. I poured a final cup of coffee and began removing my equipment from the rescue. You know, there's a point near the end of every shift when you start allowing yourself to believe that you're going home. You picture the drive, the shower, the quiet moment when the radio is no longer attached to you, and the next ringing telephone, it belongs to somebody else. I was almost there when the tones dropped. That sound, it could change the direction of an entire morning before the dispatcher spoke a single word. Conversation stopped. Coffee cups went down. Then came the call. Engine and rescue, go to rest. The dispatcher rattled off the address. I turned toward the open compartment to reload the equipment I had just removed, and then I stopped. I knew this address. My partner, he was climbing into the driver's seat when he looked at me. Whatever had crossed my face told him that I recognized it too. He paused with one hand near the ignition. He looked at me. It's Gerald again. We didn't say anything else. I put my gear back into the rescue, closed the compartment, and climbed inside. The bay door opened, the engine started, and within seconds, the quiet October morning disappeared beneath the siren. During the drive, I thought about the last time I had seen Gerald. It had been several weeks at this point, long enough for the absence to become noticeable. Familiar addresses occupy a strange place in the mind. You may go days without consciously thinking about them, yet some part of you is always waiting to hear them again. I wondered whether Gerald had gotten worse. I wondered what we would find when we reached the house this time. And somewhere beneath those questions, I already knew. The siren went silent as we approached the property. The rescue left the pavement and rolled onto the gravel driveway, and the house appeared in front of us. The front door was open. Gerald's wife was waiting. And like usual, we carried the equipment inside and followed her into the living room. There he was. Gerald sat deep in the recliner, his head resting back against the cushion. His chest was still. His family standing around him, wearing the helpless expressions I'd seen in that room before. His wife, she looked at us again and asked us to bring him back. And for a brief moment, I saw the distance between the man in the chair and the people surrounding him. Gerald had spent months moving towards this moment. His family had spent those same months trying to keep it away. Then training took over. My partner began ventilating Gerald through the opening in his neck. I accessed the port already implanted beneath his skin. The engine crew moved the gurney into place and helped clear enough room for us to lift him from the recliner. My hands, they knew what to do. They had performed the same work on Gerald before. That familiarity should have made the call easier, but it didn't. I remember his hand asking for more morphine. I remembered the way he had looked at me when I refused. And still, I worked to bring him back. It's interesting. Professional duty can carry you through moments that your conscience has not yet finished understanding. Gerald's wife, she was asking for our help. The call had been dispatched. A man was no longer breathing. Every part of my training pointed towards intervention. So I followed it. We moved Gerald from the chair and lowered him onto the gurney. My partner continued breathing for him while we worked. Air moved through Gerald's stoma and lifted his chest. Again. And again. And again. We waited for his body to answer. Eventually, it did. A weak breath, and then another. And in just a few short moments, Gerald had resumed breathing on his own. At the same time, everyone in the room seemed to release the breath they had been holding. His wife moved closer. Someone touched Gerald's shoulder. For his family, we had succeeded. I looked at Gerald lying on the gurney and wondered what success meant to him, though. We secured the straps and prepared to move. As we turned toward the front door, I glanced back at the recliner. The cushions, they still held the impression of Gerald's body. After all the times I had seen him sitting there, the chair looked strangely exposed and naked without him. For the first time, I wondered whether he would ever return to it. We rolled the gurney through the house and out into the cool morning air. The wheels crossed the threshold. Boots moved across the gravel. His family, as usual, followed us into the driveway. The ordinary sounds of the neighborhood continued around them as we loaded Gerald into the rescue. A garage door opened somewhere nearby. A dog barked behind a fence. The sky had begun to brighten along the horizon. I climbed into the back and checked on Gerald again. He was breathing. His eyes remained closed. The monitor tracing the life we had returned to him. Once the equipment was secured and there was nothing left to delay us, I told my partner we were ready. We were moving again. Gravel crunched beneath the tires. The cabinets rattled as we crossed the first small bump. Then another. I held the gurney and watched Gerald's face. The rear tires dropped into the final rut at the edge of the driveway. The rescue rocked back and forth. We climbed onto the asphalt. By the time the ride became smooth, Gerald drew in a long, deep breath and opened his eyes. A tear reached Gerald's ear and disappeared into his hair. I wiped his face and waited. The look in his eyes had carried me back to the morphine, to the question he had asked with one slow movement of his hand. He had wanted me to understand then. He needed me to understand now. I moved closer to the gurney. Gerald, do you want me to treat you? His eyes never left mine. He shook his head from side to side. The movement was small, but certain. Then his lips formed the words his voice could no longer deliver. No. For 18 months, other people had been making decisions around Gerald. His family. Hospice. Doctors. People arriving with equipment and medications. People reading documents, checking numbers, and deciding what should happen next. That morning, though, the decision belonged to him. I looked at the equipment surrounding us. Everything I had been trained to use was within reach. For most of my career, the presence of those tools meant there was always something more to do. Another intervention. Another medication. Another attempt to pull somebody back from the edge. Gerald had lived through enough of those moments. I looked at him again. Would you like me to sit here with you? He watched me closely. I'm happy to hold your hand. Something changed in his face. The tension around his eyes loosened. His forehead softened. And a quiet peace moved across him, slowly at first, and then all at once. I had never seen that expression on Gerald. During every previous transport, some part of him had remained guarded against pain, against the next breath, against whatever waited at the hospital. Now the fight seemed to leave him. I turned toward the front of the rescue and raised my voice. Go 5 miles under the speed limit. we're in no hurry. My partner, he didn't ask why. He didn't need an explanation. And a few moments later, I felt the rescue slow beneath us. Gerald felt it too. The slightest smile appeared across his face. His voice had been gone for a long time, but that smile said everything. Thank you. I climbed down from the bench. There was barely enough room between the seat and the gurney, and I had to turn sideways to lower myself onto the floor. I wedged my back against the bench and stretched my legs into whatever space remained. It was not where I was supposed to sit when the ambulance was moving, but at that moment, it was the only place I belonged. I lowered the handrail. Gerald's left hand rested near the edge of the mattress. I reached for it. His skin, it felt thin and cool against mine. His fingers moved weakly around my hand. Then he squeezed. There was very little strength behind it, but there was enough. Gerald closed his eyes. His chest rose as he drew in a deep breath. And then he released it in one long sigh. We continued down the road, mile marker after mile marker passed somewhere beyond the walls. Inside, time had lost its usual shape. I didn't watch the clock. I stopped measuring the distance to the hospital. For those few moments, there was nowhere else Gerald needed to be. No one was waiting at the end of the road with something that could restore the life cancer had taken from him. The hospital, it could wait. The paperwork, that could wait even longer. The rest of the world had already asked enough of him. I stayed on the floor and just held his hand. The ambulance swayed gently through the turns. Sunlight began slipping through the rear windows, moving across the cabinets and onto the white sheet covering Gerald's legs. I watched his face. His eyes remained closed, but the tension was gone. I often wondered where his mind had gone during those final miles. Maybe he was back inside the life he had lived before the recliner. Or maybe he was with his wife when they were young. Or he was hearing the voices of his children or picturing his grandchildren moving through the house. And perhaps there were just no thoughts left at all. Only the relief of finally being allowed to rest. Whatever Gerald carried inside him during those last few moments, they remained his. I could accompany him only so far. Every now and then, I felt the slightest movement in his fingers, and I couldn't tell whether Gerald was still squeezing my hand or whether his body was slowly releasing it. But I chose to keep holding on. About halfway to the hospital, the weight of his hand changed. It settled a little bit more heavily into mine. Then his fingers went still. Gerald's chest, it didn't rise again. There was no more struggle. No sudden movement. No final attempt to pull himself back. The monitor changed beside us. Its long tone filled the ambulance and told me what I'd already felt through his hand. Gerald was gone. For a few moments, I just remained on the floor. I kept his hand in mine while the rescue carried us down the road. You know, I had been present for so many deaths during my career. Some, they arrived during noise and urgency, surrounded by people working desperately against the inevitable. But Gerald's death arrived quietly. A man closed his eyes, released a final breath, and left his tired body while someone held his hand. I climbed from the floor and confirmed what the stillness had already made clear. Then I looked at Gerald's face, made sure his eyes were closed. And for the first time in the 18 months that I had known him, there was no pain in it, no frustration, no silent request waiting for someone to understand. Gerald had finally found the peace his family had wanted for him, even though they had not been ready for the way it arrived. The two of us, we carried that final moment together. Gerald, he simply reached the end of it first. I reached for the radio and called the receiving hospital. For the next few moments, I spoke the language I had learned to use when emotion needed to wait. I gave him Gerald's history. I explained what happened at the house, the treatment we had provided, and the decision Gerald had made after regaining consciousness. The patient exercised his DNR en route. Those words, they sounded clean, official, almost untouched by what had just happened. I told the doctor we would not need the code team waiting when we arrived. He acknowledged the information. I recorded the time. The call ended. And Gerald became Gerald again. I set the radio down and sat on the bench beside him. His left hand resting near the edge of the gurney where I had placed it just a few moments earlier. And before that, that hand had been holding mine. Now, it looked strangely separate from everything I had just experienced. Still, open. Empty of the small effort it had taken to squeeze my fingers. I looked at Gerald's face. Without pain pulling at his features, he seemed different. Younger, perhaps. Or maybe I was finally seeing the man who had been hidden beneath all that suffering. I thought about his wife waiting back at the house. She had asked us to bring him back one more time. And for a little while, we had. I wondered how we would tell her that Gerald had made a different choice once the ambulance doors closed. I wondered whether she would understand or whether she would be angry. Whether some part of her would feel relieved that the decision had finally been taken out of her hands. She would return to the living room and see the recliner sitting there empty. The blanket might still be folded across the arms. His medication would remain where she had placed him. The television remote would be nearby. Every object in the room would still belong to Gerald. Although Gerald would never sit among them again. I don't know which thought finally opened something in me. Maybe there wasn't one particular one. I had spent 18 months watching Gerald disappear in pieces. That morning, I was present when the last piece left. Somewhere between the phone call and the hospital, I began to cry. At first, the tears came quietly. Then, they just kept coming. I wiped them away and tried to collect myself, but there was no one in the back of the rescue who needed me to pretend. My partner continued driving. He didn't call through the small opening between the cab and the patient compartment. He didn't ask whether I was all right. The rescue simply carried us forward at the same gentle speed. I just sat beside Gerald and let the tears come. During a 25-year career, I learned how to move from one call to the next. You finish the work in front of you. You clean the equipment. You replace what you had used. You wrote the report. Then the tones would drop again, and someone else's worst day required your full attention. Most patients pass through my life that way. A face, an address, a brief intersection between their story and mine. Over time, many of those details have faded, though. But Gerald remained. I don't know how long I had been crying when I felt the rescue slow. There was a turn, followed by the familiar rise into the hospital drive, the building appearing through the rear windows. We were there. And for a few moments, I just stayed where I was. Then I wiped my face with my sleeve and drew in a breath. I stood and pulled the sheet a little tighter across Gerald's chest, smoothed it out with my hand. I mean, there was no medical reason to do that. It simply felt like something one person should do for another before opening the doors. The rescue came to rest. My partner walked around the back. When the doors opened, the October morning entered all at once. Cool air, pale sunlight, the sounds of a hospital beginning another day. I did the best I could do to dry my eyes before we released the gurney. Then we wheeled Gerald inside one last time. You know, More than 20 years have passed since that morning. I still don't remember the year. The address is gone now. So is the doctor's name, the report I wrote, and whatever became of the equipment we used in Gerald's living room. For a long time, I remembered him as one of our frequent flyers. It was the language of the job. A familiar patient, a familiar house, another call at the end of another shift. Time changed the way I carried him, though. Now, when I think of Gerald, I think of the man behind the patient. I think about all the hours he spent silently watching life move around his recliner. I think about the things he may have wanted to say and the effort it took to try to make himself understood. I think about the trust inside of that final look. Gerald entered my life near the end of his. We came from different places and stood in very different seasons. Our paths crossed inside a living room, along a gravel driveway, and in the narrow space in the back of an ambulance. That crossing, it lasted 18 months. The part that mattered most, though, lasted maybe 10 minutes. And that was long enough. Gerald's life ended before we reached the hospital. But his story, it continued down the road with me. Even now, sitting here, thinking about it, I can feel the rescue slowing beneath us. I can see the small smile settle across his face. I can feel his hand closing weakly around mine. And somewhere in an October morning, more than 20 years behind me, two men are still traveling 5 miles under the speed limit, with no siren and no reason to hurry. Thanks for spending some time with me today. I hope you enjoyed the story as much as I enjoyed sharing it with you. Until next time, take notice of ordinary things before they become nothing more than memories. And I hope that sometime soon, our paths cross somewhere along the way.